I've known Scott for 35 years or something. We go way back before probably either of us necessarily thought we would be standing here in this situation. But Scott currently is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Democracy, Rights, and Labor in the State Department, which Scott will talk about, but the area that is really tasked with its focus on human rights in the State Department, anyhow. He previously has worked he was the Director of Human Rights in the National Security Council in the White House under Samantha Powers in the Obama White House, and also worked in a similar position in the Clinton White House as well. I'm just going to hand it over to Scott. So Scott's going to present about the work that DRL does, how they assist in many of the cases we're working on, and then he can also answer some questions you have. I would say I don't know that Scott will necessarily be able to answer specific questions specific to every case, but certainly can answer questions specific to every region and what's going on in the human rights records in the contemporary moment. So Scott Busby.
Thank you, Adam. What Adam didn't say is that 35 years ago we were actually in a rock and roll band together for a very brief period of time. He was the star. I was just the backup. But that goes to show you, lesson to be learned there. You end up crossing paths with people throughout your life, particularly if you stay in the same field of work, like human rights or refugee work. So don't burn your bridges too quickly unless you absolutely have to, because you end up, as I say, reconnecting with people in the field. Indeed, I ended up getting my position because I was qualified, of course, but the Assistant Secretary for Human Rights in the first Obama term had been the boss of an organization I interned at when I was in law school. And after I interned for him, we would periodically cross paths, and then all of a sudden he was there. I was at the White House. We were talking a lot. He said, "Why don't you come work for me?" And anyway, and stuff like that. It's amazing how much that happens over the course of one's life. So live and learn. DRL. So I don't know how familiar you are with the State Department. State Department is made up of a range of bureaus and offices. The core of the State Department is 6 regional bureaus that divide the world up into regions. So one region is the Western Hemisphere, another region is Europe, a third region is the Near East and North Africa, another region is Africa, there's another region called South Central Asia, which includes everything from Pakistan to Bhutan. And then there's another bureau called the East Asian Pacific Affairs Bureau. And those regional bureaus are sort of the original bureaus that made up the State Department. And they're responsible for overseeing the work of our embassies in those regions. We have embassies in almost every country in the world. And those embassies include people who do human rights, who do trade, who do general political affairs, who do consular work, approving visas or helping American citizens who are in trouble overseas. And those embassies report up to the regional bureaus, and then the regional bureaus have responsibility for sort of setting overall policy for a region. Now, of course, overall policy is set by the Secretary of State and the President and through the National Security Council, which involves other agencies. But the day-to-day is managed by these regional bureaus. Separate from the regional bureaus are what we call functional bureaus, which deal with specific sets of issues. So we're one such bureau. There's a bureau that deals with refugee issues. There's a bureau that deals with environmental issues. There's a bureau that does international narcotics and law enforcement. There's a specific office that deals with trafficking in persons. So there are a range of kind of specialized offices, but they tend to be newer offices. So the core of foreign policy is driven by the regional bureaus on a day-in, day-out basis. And our job in DRL as a functional bureau, our mandate as given to us by Congress, is to try to ensure that adequate attention is paid to human rights in the conduct of our policy. And so I'll dive in here, and we'll get into some more details in a second. This lays out our mandate, which you can read, the gist of which is that human rights are important and we integrate it into our foreign policy. I'm going to do a little history of human rights here because the history is largely coterminous with sort of the history of DRL. Not at the very beginning, but human rights comes partly out of religion. Most religions of the world have some concept of respect for the individual, respect for the well-being of the individual, which informed the kind of invention of human rights, if you will. The Enlightenment is when philosophers like John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau began to articulate more explicitly a concept of rights. And then interestingly, and Adam will like this because he's a writer, as many of you know, there's a historian of France, Lynn Hunt, at UCLA, who's written a book about the history of human rights. And one of her claims is that the rise of the novel in the early 18th century also gave rise to the concept of human rights as it emerged towards the end of the 18th century. Essentially, the novel didn't really exist prior to 1600s, 1700s, but there became a growing interest in the novel in the early 1700s. It was mostly geared towards women, a women readership, and a lot of the novels were about poor, oppressed individual women who felt restricted in their circumstances, who were being mistreated. And the point of these books was to elicit sympathy for the plight of the protagonist in the book. And Lynn Hunt's claim is that that, too, gave rise to the notion that individuals have rights that should be protected. The articulation of rights, of course, was most fully realized with first the issuance of the Declaration of Independence. Lynn Hunt's book very rightly says, of course, the Declaration says that these truths are self-evident. But if they were self-evident, why did it take until 1776 to articulate them? And so part of what she's doing is talking about what caused them to become self-evident. So the Declaration of Independence articulates a concept of rights. Of course, those concepts are in the Constitution and most prominently in the Bill of Rights, and then in the French Declaration on the Rights of Man and the Citizen. And interestingly, the rights articulated in those documents are mostly the core rights which we continue to spend most of our time on today. In fact, most of our work in DRL is on what we call the fundamental freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of peaceful assembly, freedom of association, freedom of religion. And all those rights or those freedoms are actually encompassed in our own First Amendment. But of course, they've been re-articulated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. But they end up being the core rights that most of the human rights community spends most of their time paying attention to. The modern human rights era begins in the beginning of the 20th century. Interestingly, labor rights have been around for longer than, labor rights treaties have been around longer than most other human rights instruments of the 20th century. The ILO, the International Labor Organization, is in fact about to celebrate its 100th anniversary, so it predates the UN. But World War II was obviously key to developing concept of rights, which then were reflected in the Universal Declaration, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and a range of other treaties, and I've noted here the ones that the U.S. has ratified and the ones we haven't ratified. DRL came into being in the mid to late 1970s when Congress, in the wake of the Vietnam War, in the wake of the overthrow of Salvador Allende in Chile, and some other things that Congress was upset about in terms of what we were doing in our foreign policy, Congress said we need a special bureau to help focus the U.S. government on these issues, to help ensure that these issues get adequate attention. At the same time as our bureau was created, we were also mandated to come up with annual reports on the human rights situation in every country in the world. The purpose being that Congress wanted to know about human rights in a given country before or as it was making decisions about who to give assistance to. So there was a link between assistance-related policy and human rights, which continues to this day. In fact, just before coming here, I was at a meeting, what we call a murder board, where we were preparing our senior official to roll out our annual human rights reports, which is likely to happen in the next 10 days. And those documents, I hope you all are using and looking at, because they really are among the foremost documents on human rights around the world. Our embassies in every country in the world are responsible for collecting data about human rights in those countries. They do an initial draft of the report, comes to Washington, and then we finalize these reports. And they're pretty solid source information. We only report on what we consider to be credible sources or credible reports. And after the creation of the Coordinator on Human Rights and the Mandate on Country Reports, our Bureau came into being in 1977. This 502B of the Foreign Assistance Act articulates the connection Congress wanted to make between assistance and human rights. And I would call your attention to the second paragraph in particular. No assistance is to be provided to a government which engages in a consistent pattern of gross violations of internationally recognized human rights. So that was what Congress was after, basically. Interestingly, this provision has actually been very infrequently invoked, infrequently applied, but the concept is still there. The threat is still there. And gross violations of human rights, which appears elsewhere in U.S. law, basically refers to torture, extrajudicial killings, prolonged arbitrary detention, disappearance, or other flagrant denials of the right to life, liberty, or security of the person. President Reagan also gave a major speech on democracy and human rights in the early 1980s at Westminster in the UK. He talked about the importance of democracy and human rights to U.S. foreign policy, to the evolution of any society. He talked about the importance of a free press, unions, political parties, universities. And simultaneously, or in this speech, he talked about creating a special entity within the U.S. government, not within the U.S. government, a special entity with U.S. funds standing apart from the U.S. government, called the National Endowment for Democracy, whose job would be to support democratic organizations around the world. And the NED, as it's called, includes a number of what we call core institutes. There is a core institute affiliated with our Republican Party, a core institute affiliated with our Democratic Party. SIPE is a core institute devoted to private enterprise, and then the Solidarity Center is devoted to promotion of labor rights. And they get a separate appropriation from the Congress each year, which they dispense to NGOs and others around the world. And I suspect some of the cases that you all are working on involve people who benefit from NED support or benefit or whose organizations benefit from NED support. Other laws in the U.S. involving human rights, Congress passed a special act on religious freedom because they decided this was a particularly important right to focus on, sort of consistent with the history of attention to religion in the United States. This law created a special ambassador at large for religious freedom, a special office on religious freedom. It mandated a separate report on religious freedom, which we're also in the throes of finalizing, and it also mandated that the Secretary of State decide each year on countries where there is a particular concern about lack of respect for religious freedom, and those countries in turn are subject to economic sanctions. DRL's goals are to advocate for post-World War II human rights, to support those advocating for human rights in their home countries, and to fulfill a number of our statutory and legal obligations. And we do that through diplomacy, both bilateral and multilateral, showing the links between human rights and security, peace, and prosperity, and as I already mentioned, supporting civil society organizations and human rights defenders. What are our primary tools? Economic sanctions, imposing sanctions on individuals who abuse human rights. So our Treasury Department has the authority now under the Global Magnitsky Act, which we'll talk about in a second, to impose, to prevent a human rights abuser from accessing the U.S. banking system. Now, one might think, oh, well, that just means that they can't do stuff in the U.S., but the U.S. banking system is the primary banking system in the world. So if you're sanctioned in the U.S. banking system, it's very difficult for you to do business just about anywhere in the world. We have broad authorities to impose or to deny visas to people who abuse human rights. Under the Leahy Law, we can withhold assistance to security force units that abuse human rights. We have a number of reports that we issue each year. The third report, which I haven't mentioned, is the Child Soldiers Prevention Act report, which reports on countries that recruit or use child soldiers. We continue to withdraw assistance in some cases in which governments are abusing human rights. And then we do a variety of programming of financial support for human rights advocates and organizations, as well as public diplomacy. The Leahy Law is a very well-known law that Senator Leahy developed in the late 1990s, specifically denying assistance to security units that engage in gross violation of human rights. So that means that any foreign soldier or police officer who comes to the U.S. for training or who even trains overseas using U.S. money has to be vetted to see whether or not they might be implicated in human rights abuses individually or their unit is implicated in human rights abuse. And we probably vet, I forget what the number is, I want to say 300,000 to 400,000 individuals and or units each year. We also vet the sale of munitions to governments to seek to ensure that they aren't used to commit human rights abuses. And we're also part of something called the Atrocity Prevention Board, which was established in the last administration, which is aimed at trying to anticipate places where atrocities might occur and to try to get ahead of those situations and prevent the atrocities from occurring. Under the Child Soldiers Prevention Act, it's aimed at preventing the unlawful recruitment and use of child soldiers. And as I mentioned, each year, as part of this report, we have to identify those countries that use or recruit child soldiers. And that law, much like the religious freedom law and the trafficking in persons law, restricts assistance. You can't provide lots of assistance to countries that do use child soldiers. Many of you have probably heard of the Magnitsky Act before. It is named after a Russian lawyer named Serge Magnitsky, who worked for a guy named Bill Browder. You may be seen Bill Browder on television. He is actually the grandson of the head of the U.S. Communist Party, who was head of the U.S. Communist Party in the 1930s. But instead of becoming a communist, he became an extreme capitalist. He went to Stanford Business School, and then he moved to Eastern Europe after the fall of the wall and was investing in things first in Eastern Europe and then in the former Soviet Union. Made a lot of money. Russians with power saw that he was making money, started going after his assets. Serge Magnitsky called out some of the corruption that he saw among the Russian elite, was thrown in jail and died in jail, largely because he wasn't given the medical treatment that he needed. He was also tortured and abused in jail. So following his death, Bill Browder left the Soviet Union and led this campaign to try to honor Serge Magnitsky. And the chief goal of that campaign was this law, which initially imposed sanctions on any individuals involved in the detention, abuse, prosecution of Serge Magnitsky, or the cover-up after the prosecution of the abuses that Serge Magnitsky was involved in. So it was initially focused on only the people who abused Serge Magnitsky's rights. It's now been expanded to apply to any Russian person or entity engaged in gross violations or serious violations of human rights, which is more or less the same as gross. Recently, in 2016, the Magnitsky Act was globalized. I mentioned that before. So now the Congress has given us the authority to impose economic sanctions or visa restrictions on any abuser of human rights anywhere in the world. So towards the end of 2017, the Trump administration issued its first report under the Global Magnitsky Act, and under which we sanctioned, I forget the number, I want to say 60 some odd individuals or entities. And we continue to sanction new people using this authority. Many human rights groups, to the extent that you all have contact with human rights groups, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Human Rights First, are all pushing us to apply Global Magnitsky sanctions in all sorts of different places. So it's become a hotly debated topic in the U.S. And indeed, recently, the Congress sent a letter to the administration saying, we want you to assess whether or not Mohammed bin Salman, the Prince of Saudi Arabia, to assess whether or not he is responsible for the killing of Jamal Khashoggi and thus should be sanctioned under the Global Magnitsky Act. He hasn't been sanctioned so far, but Congress is pushing the administration to do this. So you're going to, as you get more into human rights, you're going to hear and read about Global Magnitsky, or what we call GLOMAG. As I mentioned before, there are lots of authorities to deny visas to people who commit human rights. Recently, we've been using the first authority here, Section 212A3C, which is a broad authority that allows the Secretary of State to deny visas to anyone on foreign policy grounds. But we've been using that to carve out a group of people who are undermining democracy in their countries. So we've applied this authority in Cambodia, Democratic Republic of Congo, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and basically said anyone who has undermined democracy or abused human rights in those countries should be denied a visa. And the rest of these are more individualized authorities. The last one, Section 7031C, is a new provision which allows us not only to deny a visa to a human rights abuser, but to also publicize the fact that we did so. Ordinarily, visas are confidential, and so if we deny a visa to someone, we can't publicly say we did deny the visa. But Section 7031C gives us the ability to name and shame people who have committed gross violations of human rights. One interesting part of DRL's story is that we've gone from being initially exclusively a policy bureau concerned only with sort of promoting human rights in our policy to a programming bureau. So we've gone from getting, it was $3 million in FY98 to last year when we got $150 million. And for FY19, we actually got $160 million plus another $100 million or so of specific earmarked funds for specific countries to use for human rights purposes. So our Bureau is increasingly supporting with money the work of human rights defenders overseas. And in addition to the money we get, a lot of bureaus are transferring money to us to spend on these issues. So the Congress is extremely supportive of the work that we're doing. There are other offices or bureaus in the State Department that concern themselves with human rights-related issues, including the Office of Global Criminal Justice, the Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons. There's a specific special envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism, and there's also a Global Women's Issues Office. In fact, this morning I went to the annual presentation of what we call the International Women of Courage Awards, which are managed by the Office of Global Women's Issues. And we gave roughly 10 extraordinary women from around the world awards here. It was the Secretary of State and the First Lady who presided at the event. So you may see that in the news or read about it in the press tomorrow. What are our challenges? Well, in any situation, we often have competing equities. So even though my bureau is deeply concerned about the situation in the Xinjiang region in China, and you've probably heard about that from Jewar Toti. Her last name isn't Toti. What is it? Ilham. But she is the daughter of a very, very famous Uyghur academic who has been thrown in jail for the rest of his life. As some of you have probably heard or read, we estimate there are over 1 million Uyghurs and other Muslims in internment camps in the Xinjiang region, suffering various forms of mistreatment. But we have a lot of other competing equities with China right now, including the negotiation on trade, including negotiations on denuclearization in North Korea. So at any given moment in any country, there are lots of competing equities, and sometimes those other equities might outrank human rights in terms of what we might raise or push that government on. Obviously, countries that are non-democratic are huge challenges for us. Many human rights activists and their organizations are the subject of harassment. Some governments are simply too weak to protect or promote human rights. And then, of course, we have terrorists, which posed direct threats to people's human rights as well. And the effort to thwart terrorism also becomes a challenge in terms of respecting human rights. We always urge governments to respect human rights in the way they combat terrorism, but it's often very challenging for these governments to do that. Our leadership right now is led by Mike Kozak, a career civil servant like myself. He likes to describe himself as a holdover from the Nixon administration because he started working for the State Department in 1972, so he's seen a lot. We have Ambassador at Large Sam Brownback, former senator and governor of Kansas, myself, and we have another acting Deputy Assistant Secretary, and I need to update this slide because we just got another Deputy Assistant Secretary last week. We have a group of regional offices ourselves that mirror the big regional bureaus I talked about in the State Department, and we have some of our own thematic offices focused on issues like religious freedom, security and human rights, that sort of thing, and we have a separate office for programming. And this lists all these separate thematic offices. And here's how you can contact us. So with that, I'm happy to entertain your questions or comments. First of all, let me say, your work is our work. So thank you very much for the work that you're doing. We do a lot of individual case advocacy in my bureau, but we don't have the bandwidth to worry about every single person unjustly detained in their countries. Academic freedom is a very important issue to us. There is a section of our annual human rights reports devoted to academic freedom, but I view you as an extension of DRL and the work that you're doing. So thank you very much. Please.
Hi, thank you for coming. My name is Lily. What I want to ask about is this munitions vetting. So given that it sometimes surfaces that American weapons are involved in human rights abuses abroad, to what extent can you actually veto a munitions deal if it is vetted as leading to human rights abuses, given the money on the line? And if so, do you have any examples of when you've successfully prevented an arms deal that would have led to human rights abuses? Because because I know you mentioned sanctions, but I'm wondering to what extent that vetting turns into action on
Yep.
the part of
So it's a very
the
good
government.
question. I should first point out that unlike the Leahy Law, which absolutely prohibits assistance to any individual or unit that is responsible for human rights abuses, the munition vetting policy really is but that. It's a policy set by executive order. President Obama issued an order that addressed it, and then President Trump issued his own order. And both of those orders said human rights should be taken account of, but it doesn't. They don't say there's an absolute prohibition on any arms sale that might lead to human rights abuse. So it's just a factor to be considered. Determining whether or not a munition might be used in a human rights abuse is a very challenging thing to do, right? Because you can't always know whose hands a weapon may end up in,
So
or
as
how
a
it might
follow-up-
be used.
okay.
Huh?
So as a follow-up, how can we hold the government accountable when these weapons are used in human
We-
rights
we do-
violations abroad?
Well, if we become aware that a munition, a particular weapon, a plane, any type of munition has been used for human rights abuse, generally what we then do is stop the sale or transfer of those weapons to that government or to that particular unit. That's the primary way we do it. Yeah. And obviously, this is a big issue right now with Saudi Arabia. It's been heavily debated given the Saudis' involvement in the war in Yemen, and we've pretty dramatically scaled back what we're providing them now because of concerns about human rights abuses. But there are a number of other governments that, we have similar concerns about. Basically, if the government or if the government's security forces or the unit that's going to use the weapons has a record of human rights abuses, generally we avoid selling or transferring the munitions to that unit. Other questions? Yes.
Hi, my name is AJ Dennis, pronouns she, her, hers. I'm from Sarah Lawrence College, and we're one of the schools that's focusing on the Uyghur Muslim case in China. And
Thank you.
And you brought it up, and so I was just kind of curious about any, for lack of a better word, like inside information behind what the DRL's tactics might be in going about it, because you mentioned the various competing equities, whether it's denuclearization talks with North Korea or, the
trade talks
economics,
right now.
trade talks and
Yeah.
negotiations. But given that this isn't just an isolated incident of a human rights abuse, but likely falls under this mass atrocity,
Yeah.
which is then a separate factor, just how does that affect what the DRL does, and does the DRL have certain tactics and ideas for how to move forward with this situation in particular?
So the main thing we've been trying to do the past few months has been simply to publicize the fact that these horrific human rights abuses are going on. And as you've seen, this past weekend actually is a good example. Both the Washington Post and the New York Times had articles about the abuses in Xinjiang. Both of them were mostly focused on the ethnic Kazakhs who had been in these internment camps, many of whom were returned to Kazakhstan. They're some of the few people who've gotten out, and as a result, they are some of the few primary sources we have for what's going on in the camps. So we're trying to publicize this information as much as possible. We're holding an event next week in Geneva on the margins of the Human Rights Council. I mentioned this before, I guess, focused on the issue of Xinjiang. So we have a couple of Uyghurs coming to that, as well as some other people to speak out there. We're trying to pull together a coalition of governments to jointly pressure the Chinese government on these issues. Most of the West, most European governments, our government, Canada, Australia, are already on board with the effort, but we're trying to get Muslim-majority countries to join. You're probably aware that Turkey issued a pretty strong condemnation of what's going on there. Indonesia, Malaysia have also said some critical things, but then MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the Prince of Saudi Arabia, recently went to China and basically said the Chinese are doing the right thing. They're approaching this problem in the right way. So we haven't succeeded across the board in Muslim majority countries. So that's something that we're doing. I've mentioned to you the range of tools we have in terms of visa denial, economic sanctions, and we are exploring use of those tools yet, but a final decision hasn't been taken. And that use of those tougher tools obviously is very much tied up in the broader equities in the relationship and trying to get to yes on the trade deal or trying to ensure that China enforces the UN sanctions on North Korea or is pressuring North Korea to denuclearize. So those are the challenges we have when we want to do tougher things in the China context. But I would really urge all of you to read as much as you can about this, to share with your friends and colleagues what's going on in Xinjiang, because it probably is the most massive set of human rights abuses occurring in the world right now. You know, South Sudan, Burma, Central African Republic, there are horrific things that have happened to a lot of people, but the scale in Xinjiang is probably the largest. Yes.
You said that the Leahy Law allows you to withdraw assistance from
Deny assistance initially is the way it works. Yeah.
from countries that are
From units, security units. So it doesn't, interestingly, it was crafted, 502B of the Foreign Assistance Act basically says you can cut off all assistance to a country if there are systemic human rights abuses in that country. But after 10 years to 15 years or so of that law being around, Senator Leahy and some staff to Senator Leahy saw that it was being very infrequently applied. So in coming up with the Leahy Law, they wanted to come up with a more precise way of sanctioning bad actors. So rather than punishing the government as a whole, they said, let's focus on denying assistance to specific individuals or units.
I was just wondering what you mean and if you could be more specific about denying assistance.
So assistance is basically determined as it's security assistance, so it includes money used to train individuals from foreign security forces, of which we do a great deal. It would include weapons that we are providing with U.S. dollars to a foreign security unit, or any other type of, money even that might be sent to a country simply to support their security forces. Trucks, those sorts of things as well. If we're providing it with U.S. dollars, we have to vet the units that those items will go to before we can actually provide them with that assistance. So we have a team of vetters who literally, when our embassy says, okay, we want to train X unit in Y country, they literally will get on Google and find whatever they can in the public domain on that particular unit. They have to become sort of smart about the way the security forces in that country are structured. And then they'll go to our classified information, be it reports from our embassy in the country or intelligence reports that might shed light on the behavior of a security unit. And that's how they make a decision on whether or not that unit is clean such that it can receive assistance. Is that clear? Yes.
How come they don't just go straight to the intelligence information instead of going through the public domain first?
Oh, it's a little easier to do the public domain search first, and we figure if we can find something in the public domain, all the more, it's just easier to sort of justify. Once it gets into the classified realm, it becomes a little more challenging because part of the Leahy Law requires that we first inform the host government that we're denying assistance to X unit for gross human rights violations. And there's a new component of the law that requires that we make public those units that we're denying assistance to. And if the denial is based on classified information, it's not something that we can share necessarily with the host government or we can make public. Yes, sir.
So you said, Jacob from Sarah Lawrence College. So you said that your department releases annual reports.
Yes.
Is there anywhere in the world that over like the last 5 or 10 years has seen a dramatic decline in human rights in their country?
Yes. Now, there are other entities that do annual reports that I would urge you to look at. Freedom House is probably the oldest, and they not only report on the situation, but they actually rank countries based on how free they are, and it's a really solid report. So solid that we actually, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which is a separate assistance program we have, actually relies on Freedom House's data in determining whether or not a country should be eligible for that program. So I would urge you to look at Freedom House's annual report. Human Rights Watch, Amnesty also do annual reports. I'm sorry, now I've lost track. What did you specifically ask?
Is there any region or country?
Oh,
that
yes,
seems-
countries that, so Freedom House in particular, because they quantify a country's freedom on the Freedom Index, they just issued their annual report a month or so ago. They actually highlight the countries that have been the greatest backsliders. And let me see if I can do them off the top of my head. Tanzania is a country that's going really badly right now. China got worse. Russia got somewhat worse, although it was already pretty bad. Hungary and Poland continue to slightly decline, although they're higher, starting at a higher baseline than countries like Russia and China. I think Cuba got worse. Those are the main ones off the top of my head. I also want to say about the countries that are getting better, so it's not only a bad news story. In Africa, Ethiopia is doing dramatically better. They have a new leader there. So I urge you, if any of you catch a cab here in D.C., ask your driver whether he's from Ethiopia. 9 chances out of 10 they'll be from Ethiopia. And then ask him or her what they think of Prime Minister Abiy, the new ruler of Ethiopia. And they're all overjoyed by Abiy, who is a very reformist, democratic-minded leader. Ethiopia has a huge set of challenges given how long it's been a repressive society, but that's a good performer. I went there in July to look at how we can help them do better. Angola is doing better. I'm going there actually week after next for a human rights dialogue, and they were very anxious to have us come and have us provide advice and assistance to them to improve their human rights situation. The Gambia in Africa is doing better. Ecuador in the Western Hemisphere is doing better. Malaysia had successful elections last year, which turned out the long-standing ruling party in Malaysia for the first time in Malaysia's history. Those are the sort of success stories. So I don't want you to think it's only bad out there. There are countries that are actually doing the right thing. And part of what our Bureau wants to do is not only deny assistance and punish the wrongdoers, we also want to support and reward the countries and governments that are doing the right thing. Others? Yes, please.
I'm just wondering to what extent your Bureau relies on international tools, such as the International Criminal Court and other types of international law, compared to more domestic law.
So we do try to internationalize as much as we can our efforts when it comes to human rights. So like on Burma, called Myanmar in the UN context, we have aligned ourselves with other governments in terms of the sanctions we impose. So Canada, the EU, the UK, we've all generally imposed sanctions on the same generals and entities which were responsible for the ethnic cleansing in Rakhine State. Through the UN Security Council, we've negotiated or established sanctions on South Sudan, Democratic Republic of Congo, and other places that are, to some extent, human rights based. Very challenging to do, though, in the Security Council and the UN generally, given the Russia and China vetoes, because Russia and China almost invariably side with the human rights abuser. We don't like the ICC right now because the prosecutor is investigating wrongdoing by U.S. forces in Afghanistan. And we think that they, A, don't have the jurisdiction to do that because the U.S. didn't agree to the ICC treaty, and B, that the domestic remedies the U.S. has for addressing those sorts of abuses have not yet been exhausted. One of the doctrines in international criminal law is that the remedies or tools that might be used domestically in a given country to address a human rights abuse should be exhausted before you go to an international forum.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I was just wondering how broad-reaching the Leahy Law is. So say, for instance, if the U.S. were to give money to one of these units through another country or through some other channel, would that be protected by this, or is that only protecting, like, direct funding?
It's rare that, in fact, I'm not even sure we would give money to one country for purposes of being transferred to
There's
another
no
government.
stipulation in the.
What's that? But
There's
if
no stipulation in the law that would.
no, but we would probably say in that case, if we knew, if we were providing assistance to one government, knowing that they would in turn provide it to another government or another security unit, we would, I think we would consider that the Leahy Law applies and that we have to vet the unit that will ultimately get the assistance before they can receive it. Others? Yeah, Adam. No, I have a few more minutes, yeah.
And this goes back to the question of vetting and public information and confidential information. And I'm thinking very practically for people in this room who
Yes.
are not going to have access to confidential information. But I would venture to say that everybody at some point has run into a roadblock of information that
Yeah.
they can get or start or feel like they've discovered something new to realize it's a restating of the same information.
Right.
I'm wondering what recommendations you have for ways to get at information on specific cases and specific regions that are not,
We need to, I mean, obviously, the first thing you need to do is look not only at our reports, but at all the other human rights reports I described. And in some cases, there may be local human rights organizations that have investigated particular cases. So a very, very thorough Google search is the first thing you need to do. If that doesn't yield anything, as we have done in some cases in the past, you can come to us and we can tell you what we might know or what we might be doing about a particular case. We need to find a better way to do that. I know that some of the cases that you all work on are not, in a country like Iran where there are so many cases of people wrongly imprisoned, we're not going to know about every single case out there. But there may be some cases that we do have some information on. So we should figure out, we have desk officers, who focus on individual countries, and we should figure out a way so that you can make those queries without it necessarily overburdening our staff who are, sometimes doing other things.
Okay. My question? I mean, what my case, the case that I'm working on right now, it's with Dr. Tajali, right?
From
Can you hear
where?
me?
From
Yeah.
where?
He's in Iran right now, and he has a lot of health complications. And we were just talking about some of the issues we faced with the cases. And one of the issues we're facing with ours is the urgency of his health situation right now versus the slowness, kind of, slowness of the process of getting governmental attention and action.
So is your case, is he still in jail?
Yeah, in Evin prison in Iran. So it's a rough one.
Though that's a hard one. Yeah, and I doubt, we don't even have an embassy in Iran, right? So I don't even know what we might have on your particular, I mean, we might have something, but maybe not too. I mean, I could ask our desk officer if they have anything.
That would be
But,
great.
I mean, you should, if you know that the person has health problems, I would use that in your advocacy, obviously. The
Absolutely, yeah.
other case, Dr., what was the name of the case? Rafi was able to get out of jail partly on medical grounds. A number of Chinese dissidents who had been in jail often get released on medical grounds, so their sentences aren't, done away with. They still are kind of have the threat of jail hanging over them, but because of their physical condition, they're able to live at home kind of under surveillance or whatever, which is still better than being in jail. So it is, I would urge using that in your advocacy with the government. Yeah. Anyone else? If not, thank you again for the work that you're doing, and we look forward to continuing to partner with you.